Something is developing inside the Cleveland Browns organization that I want to address directly because the full picture of what's happening between Todd Monken and Jimmy Haslam over the quarterback situation is more consequential than most of the coverage around it is treating it. This isn't off-season noise. This isn't the routine ambiguity that NFL organizations maintain around depth chart decisions to preserve competitive leverage. What's being described by people with genuine proximity to that building is a real fault line, a head coach who has made his evaluation and is holding it under significant ownership pressure, and an owner who has not accepted that evaluation and is pushing back with real organizational force. Understanding how that tension resolves is probably the most important question facing the Cleveland Browns right now, and everything downstream, how Shedeur Sanders develops, what the 2026 season actually looks like, what this franchise becomes, flows directly from the answer. Here's what the sourced reporting is pointing toward. Todd Monken has arrived at a conclusion on his starting quarterback, and the conclusion is Shedeur Sanders, not as a tentative preference that training camp performance might revise, not as the frontrunner in a genuinely open competition, as his quarterback, the player around whom the entire offensive installation is being built, whose development the offseason is designed to serve, whose first-team reps are being protected as a matter of organizational priority rather than rotated as a diplomatic gesture to competing candidates. The specificity and consistency of what's coming out of Cleveland suggests this isn't a media projection or a fan preference being read into ambiguous signals. This is Monken's actual position, communicated internally with the kind of clarity that produces leaks because it creates friction with people who hold a different position. That friction is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Jimmy Haslam has not reached the same conclusion as his head coach. By multiple accounts, the owner of the Cleveland Browns still wants Deshaun Watson to have a legitimate opportunity to compete for and potentially win the starting job. His reasoning, when you examine it honestly rather than dismissively, has real dimensions to it even if the football logic doesn't ultimately support it. Watson's contract represents $230 million in fully guaranteed money, one of the most consequential financial commitments in the history of NFL ownership. Every day that contract exists without producing wins creates organizational pressure that coaches simply don't experience the same way owners do. Haslam has partners, business relationships, a fan base he made specific promises to, and an organizational reputation that is tied to a decision that has not returned what it cost. The psychological impulse to extract something more from that investment before formally closing the chapter is real and human and understandable. I'm not dismissing it as pure irrationality, but understanding where Haslam's position comes from doesn't make it the right football call, and that distinction is the heart of everything that matters here. The internal medical evaluation of Watson's physical condition, as it's been described by people with access to the actual conversations inside that building, isn't framed in the language of normal quarterback injury risk. It's described in terms significantly more acute than that. The concern reportedly is that Watson could sustain serious injury within the opening possessions of any game he starts, not across the arc of a full season, not after absorbing significant contact over multiple weeks, in the opening minutes before the offense has executed a meaningful number of plays. If that's an accurate description of the internal medical picture, and the sourced consistency of that characterization suggests it's not fabricated, then the football logic of building a season around Watson becomes indefensible regardless of what the contract says. You cannot ask a coaching staff to invest the full weight of their preparation into a player whose availability they genuinely doubt from the first snap. You cannot ask a fan base that has absorbed years of this specific disappointment to emotionally invest in a product that your own people consider physically unreliable before kickoff. When a medical evaluation reaches that level of severity about a starting quarterback, the coaching staff's decision has already been made by the circumstances. Monkin isn't being unreasonably aggressive in his commitment to Shedeur. He's being responsive to a medical reality that makes the Watson alternative genuinely untenable as a serious football decision. What I find most revealing about this entire dynamic, the detail that tells you the most about Todd Monken as a coach and as a person, is what he's doing with the ownership pressure rather than what he'd do without it. A coach who folds the moment an owner expresses a strong preference is not, in the meaningful sense, running his own program. He's managing an employment relationship, and that management shapes every significant decision he makes in ways that gradually and then suddenly compromise the integrity of the football operation. The coaching staffs that ultimately produce results are the ones led by people who absorb organizational pressure, process it honestly, and then return to the position their football evaluation supports rather than the position that protects the relationship with the person who signs their checks. Monken, by every account coming out of Cleveland, is doing exactly that. He is not creating more wiggle room in his language to give Haslam somewhere to land. He is not sending quiet signals to Watson's camp that the competition remains genuinely open. He is standing where he stood when he made his evaluation, and that is the most important leadership quality he could demonstrate at this specific moment in the organization's history. Let me put the Cleveland franchise context around all of this, because I think the historical weight of what's happening right now deserves acknowledgement rather than being treated as backdrop. The Browns' quarterback situation has been one of the most painful sustained stories in professional football for the better part of 2 decades. The list of players who generated genuine organizational hope before the ceiling collapsed is long enough and consistent enough to have become definitional to how people understand this franchise. Veterans brought in for stability, young players drafted to build around, a record-breaking contract that represented the organization's most aggressive attempt yet to resolve a problem they'd been unable to solve through conventional means. None of it produced the foundation the franchise desperately needed. Watson is only the most recent and most expensive chapter in that pattern, and by any honest measure, it has been the most damaging chapter. The most organizational resources consumed, the most significant roster flexibility surrendered, the least produced in return. The Cleveland fan base has lived through all of it. Every press conference where a coaching staff expressed public confidence in a quarterback who then failed to deliver. Every season that began with real belief and ended with the familiar reset of expectations and the familiar cycle of searching for a new answer. These are people who have continued to invest emotionally in a franchise under circumstances that would have exhausted most supporter bases, and they deserve to have the people making decisions for this organization operating with the kind of clarity and conviction that produces something different from the cycle they've been living through. What Monkin appears to be offering, a full organizational commitment to developing Shedeur Sanders with no artificial competition diluting the preparation, is the approach that could actually produce that different outcome. Not because Shedeur's success is guaranteed, because nothing in professional football can be guaranteed, but because the method is right. Commitment to a young quarterback, first-team reps from the opening of the offseason, a scheme installation built around his specific physical and cognitive profile, a season where his development is the organizational priority rather than one of several competing considerations. That is how franchises build durable answers at the most important position in professional sports. The half-measure alternative, where Watson receives meaningful first-team time throughout the offseason to manage the ownership relationship, where the competition stays technically open to avoid forcing the internal confrontation, where Shedeur is the nominal front-runner but the organizational resources remain divided. That version produces the worst possible outcome on every dimension simultaneously. It slows Shedeur's development by denying him the full preparation infrastructure he needs. It extends Watson's uncertainty rather than resolving it with the honesty that serves everyone involved. And it signals to the entire locker room that the people running the organization aren't sure enough about their own direction to operate consistently on it. Locker rooms read those signals with precision that front offices sometimes underestimate. And the absence of clarity at the top cascades downward through every level of the team's daily function in ways that accumulate into competitive disadvantage before a regular season game has been played. Watson's response to the direction things are heading has not, by accounts coming from inside the building, reflected the professional composure that might give the organization a reason to reconsider. His competitive belief in his own ability to still contribute at a starting level is genuine. I don't doubt that he sincerely believes he has meaningful professional football left in him, and in a vacuum, some form of that belief would be admirable. Competitors don't accept diminished roles without resistance, and the resistance itself reflects something real about a player's internal standards. But Cleveland in 2026 is not a vacuum. It is the specific documented reality of 19 games in 5 years, 2 Achilles injuries, including a re-tear during recovery, a trade market that produced 0 interested organizations despite genuine efforts to find one, and internal medical evaluations described in language that goes considerably beyond normal injury concern. A loud reaction to being passed over doesn't change any of those facts. It doesn't alter the medical timeline. It doesn't move the needle on any of the organizational calculations that produce the evaluation Monkin has made. And it creates locker room complexity that serves nobody's interests, including Watson's own. Here is where I land on all of this, stated as directly as I can. Monkin is right. Not just in the narrow tactical sense of making the correct depth chart decision for Week 1 of the 2026 season, philosophically right in the sense that matters for what this franchise is actually trying to become. The Cleveland Browns have spent years making quarterback decisions that were shaped more by the need to justify previous commitments than by honest assessment of what gives them the best path forward. Sunk cost reasoning is not unique to Cleveland. Every organization in professional sports struggles with it. But it has been especially costly for this franchise at the most important position on the roster. The Watson contract is an enormous sunk cost. The money is already committed. It doesn't return regardless of whether Watson starts or doesn't start, regardless of how many first-team reps he receives during OTAs, regardless of how the competition gets framed publicly. The only question that remains is what gives the Cleveland Browns the best chance of building something worth building. And when you examine that question honestly, without the emotional weight of the financial commitment distorting the analysis, the answer points in one direction. The coming weeks will determine whether Monkin's position holds under the pressure it's currently facing. If it holds, if Haslam ultimately accepts the judgment his coach has delivered and the organizational structure gets built around Shedeur with the full commitment the situation requires, Cleveland enters 2026 with something genuinely new at the quarterback position. Not just a starter, but a developmental priority surrounded by the full infrastructure that young quarterbacks need to become what their ceiling allows. If it doesn't hold, if the pressure produces the kind of muddied compromise that keeps Watson's path technically open and divides the organizational resources that should be concentrated behind Shedeur's preparation, the consequences will show up in the football. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the accumulated small ways that organizational indecision always shows up when the games start mattering. I know which version of this the football evidence supports, and I think anyone who's been watching this franchise honestly, through all the cycles of hope and disappointment and reset, knows exactly which version they've been waiting for.